Good morning, class. This is Mr. Stewart, and this mini lecture is going to be in regard to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is entitled Vulnerability Assessments. So far what we've been talking about in the course, we started out with data-driven security, which kind of the key or buzzwords to that was what cannot be measured cannot be managed. So we stressed kind of the importance of being able to measure something and using that measurement, that numerical measurement, or however we decided to measure it, as a way to manage whatever it is we're trying to keep secure. Chapter 2, we looked at asset identification in order to try to determine what things were assets to the company, what was an asset, what the definition of an asset is, etc. Then we looked at threat identification, how we go about identifying threats to our assets. And then we looked at crime analysis last week, which had to do with how we go about getting some data in regard to past crimes that may have been affected against our facility, and how we can use that data. And then this week we're going to be talking about vulnerability assessment. The vulnerability assessment is also a very important component of securing any facility. Yes, you need to understand how to develop your numbers, your statistics, measure it so you can manage it. That was Chapter 1. How we identify what the critical assets are for our company, Chapter 2. How we identify what the threats are, Chapter 3. How we go back and look at past criminal actions in order to help us predict future actions and continue to more effectively secure our location, Chapter 4. But today we're going to be talking about vulnerability. And vulnerability is basically an opportunity. If you have a vulnerability in your organization, whether it be in the physical location, in the information, or in the personnel, what that does is open up a weakness or a gap that somebody could exploit, or some entity could exploit. And that problem is you don't want to be exploited. It doesn't matter if you are trying to secure the Fruit of the Loom underwear manufacturing facility, or if you're trying to secure a top secret nuclear weapons facility. You don't want any vulnerabilities, because vulnerabilities open you up to exploitation. And when you're opened up for exploitation, then there are threats. And threats are not good for security. So what can what vulnerabilities encompass? Well, it could be a structural issue. It may be something in regard to the building that you're in. Maybe there's a problem with the building, with the architecture. Maybe there's a structural issue, in which case that if that building were to collapse or part of that building were to fail, then you're looking at there's a weakness or a gap there that could set you up for a loss. You could look at procedural assessments. Or procedural vulnerabilities. What a procedural vulnerability is some weakness or gap in your procedures that would allow you to be exploited in some shape, form, or fashion. Electronic vulnerabilities, maybe there's some sort of backdoor into your information system. Maybe you're using cloud-based data storage or something like that, which we know is not necessarily secure. And of course there could be human vulnerabilities, which is your people. Maybe you have people that simply are open to being exploited themselves, and therefore they're going to exploit you in order for more personal gain or something like that. So it's just important that you recognize what your vulnerabilities are so that you can better enact procedures. You can better prepare your physical structure, you can better secure your information infrastructure, and you can hire and keep and train better people so that they would not be open to exploitation. So a vulnerability assessment then is an analysis of security weaknesses and opportunities for enemies or adversaries to exploit the company in any of the above categories. How do we go about determining what a vulnerability is? We look at all the things that we looked at thus far. What can we measure? What's past history in regard to crimes? What are the assets that we're trying to protect? Knowing what your assets are is a critical point of determining whether or not they're vulnerable or not. If you don't know what your assets are, you have no idea whether you're vulnerable or you're not vulnerable to any type of attack or threat or exploitation, weakness, or gap. So it's very important that as part of securing whatever facility that you're trying to secure, and that could be anywhere from, again, that Fruit of the Loom underwear manufacturing facility, a pencil manufacturing facility, all the way to a food manufacturing facility or defense industry manufacturing facility, or simply even a military base or a school. Schools have lots of vulnerabilities, typically because they have weaknesses or gaps in their structure, because there's usually a lot of doors. If you take the Huntsville campus of Calhoun for example, you have several doors that people could actually go out of that probably cannot be physically watched 24/7, 365. So there's a possibility that one of those doors, while not being watched, could be used to exploit the campus in some shape, form, or fashion, i.e. set us up as a vulnerability. If you think about the Virginia Tech shooting, that particular shooter had actually made a trial run about 2 weeks before. He actually had went in, chained up some of the doors, moved through the building to see if he could move through the building undetected at a particular time of day. It worked, so that built his confidence up, and when the day came, he did the exact same thing he did on the trial run. He chained the door shut, he moved through the building undetected until he started going into the classrooms and shooting people. So just understand that assessing your vulnerability is a critical step in securing your facility. Virginia Tech had not done a very good vulnerability assessment, at least in that building where that shooting happened. So you keep those things in mind. Okay, so what is the scope of vulnerability assessments? Well, it really depends on the goal of your security team. Understand that a vulnerability assessment is a systematic approach used to assess a facility's security posture and analyze the effectiveness of whatever your existing security program is. So you assess the vulnerability based upon the criticality of the asset. It might be based or geared toward only protecting the most critical assets, or even to protect everything. Take for example the underwear manufacturing facility example I've been using. If they're not making underwear and shipping it out, they're experiencing losses and they're not making a profit. That's the idea behind manufacturing, is to let's make a product that people will buy, let's make it as cheaply as possible, and let's get it out into the market so that it will sell and we will get money. That's the whole idea behind free enterprise. Well, if you look at that type of facility, almost everything might even be considered vulnerable, because any break in your manufacturing chain could cause a loss. So you would probably want to do a good job of trying to assess everything. Now let's switch gears and think for just a minute about a nuclear power plant. While you want to secure everything, some of the assets in there are much more critical than others. Yes, you're going to have a level of security that will protect the full range of assets at that nuclear power plant, but you're going to have a higher and more serious level of security to protect certain things, like the fuel rods, like the control room. I mean, the control room in a nuclear power plant is such a critical asset, because if there's a malfunction, if somebody gets in there and pushes the wrong switches at the wrong times, you can have a massive release of radiation. People can die. You can have an explosion. You could have delayed injuries or deaths. I mean, just look at what happened at Chernobyl in Russia. They're still dealing with the effects of basically having an unsecured nuclear power plant well, the reactor was in the equivalent of a tin shed. There was no protection, so it was very vulnerable, and it was vulnerable to failure because of some of the problems, not only with its design and architecture, but it definitely had some structural vulnerabilities. If there was a failure, there was nothing to contain that radiation. And when they had the meltdown at Chernobyl, 25 or 30 years ago, you had a massive poisoning of a big population, not only of people but wildlife, and it's scarring of the land, etc. So it's important that you conduct vulnerability analyses on whatever your assets are. Determine if you're trying to secure the whole place or simply some of the major critical assets. So let's talk about two types of vulnerability assessment for just a moment. The first type I want to talk about is what we call an asset-based vulnerability assessment. This is a really broad evaluation of the assets. And if you think about it like this, think about it, the example I used on the PowerPoint, a bank might conduct an asset-based vulnerability assessment to see how vulnerable the cash in the vault is to theft or destruction. So if they were to have a fire in the bank, would the vault withstand the heat, and would what was in the vault survive? Or how easy would it be for somebody to get into the vault and steal whatever's in the vault? So that's an asset-based vulnerability assessment. It's based on one particular critical asset. And how vulnerable it is to either a physical loss or an information loss or destruction or whatever type of loss you can think of. How likely is this particular specific asset to be deemed vulnerable? And it's broad because you're looking at it from almost every possible way you can imagine to keep this one particular specific asset protected. You could do an asset-based vulnerability assessment on a larger scale if you're using multiple assets, but you're trying to protect it from lots of different things. Now, we can also use what we call scenario-based vulnerability assessments. Scenario-based vulnerability assessments really focus on the attacks themselves. What's the likelihood of something very specific happening here? For example, if you use the bank example again, what's the likelihood that this bank will be specifically robbed and somebody being able to get into that vault and steal the cash? Or steal cash from the tellers. That's a scenario based. When you start trying to play these little things out in your mind, what if? When I teach law enforcement officers, I tell them that they need to be playing a what if game almost all the time they have any downtime when they're not doing something else, because it helps them to build schemas in their mind so that when and if something does happen, they already have some basis of knowledge for how to respond to that. Well, that's what scenario-based vulnerability assessment is. It's simply when you start playing out all these particular hypotheticals in your mind and actually on paper as a way to better prepare yourself for the likelihood of something happening. So a scenario-based vulnerability assessment evaluates vulnerability by asking how a target might be attacked. Now, it requires a little more effort and a little more knowledge than your asset-based vulnerability assessment. The asset-based vulnerability assessment is on general terms. How likely are for us to experience a loss in this area? Whereas the scenario-based vulnerability assessment is much more specific, and it's focused on how likely are we to experience a loss of this particular asset through these particular means. So it requires a knowledgeable assessment using team members who have a larger basis of knowledge, and they must have an understanding of the history and can foresee the methods used by adversaries in the future. So you can see that we start to put some of the stuff that we've talked about already together. You use crime crime data, crime analysis. You used the assets that you have identified, what the likely threats are, and you start putting it all together. When you put it all together, then you have a scenario-based vulnerability assessment. Scenario-based vulnerability assessments includes selecting the particular scenario. And honestly, there could be multiple scenarios to attack even one specific asset. So you're going to have to focus on, to begin with, the most likely thing to happen, or the scenario that would lead to the greatest loss. Focus on that one first, and then you need to prioritize and move down kind of your list until you've covered every possible scenario for loss, and you've developed a policy or procedure in order to prevent that or to handle that if the chain of events were to begin. So you got to have a scenario selection first. Then you have to study your target characteristics. You have to look at, what is it about my asset that's important? What is it about my asset that makes somebody want to take it or destroy it? And why am I the target? So that's what we call you looking at target characteristics. Then you need to evaluate certain adversaries and attack modes. What are the most likely ways that this asset could be lost, or we could experience a loss through some attack to this asset? So it's kind of like you got to know what you got, and you have to know what other groups know what you have, and what is their opportunity, what is the likelihood that they would attack, and if they did attack, can they carry it out, and would you actually experience a loss? You also have to evaluate the likelihood of your existing security's ability to handle the attack. That's another part. If you can't prevent it, and understand that we cannot prevent every single thing. If you can't prevent it and it does happen, how big is your loss going to be based upon your security response to that loss? Is it something you're going to be protecting with armed personnel? And if there's an attack, they're going to be prepared to fight for that asset? I mean, look at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve banks throughout the United States have armed personnel who have automatic weapons, and if you try to conduct an attack, a physical attack on one of the Federal Reserve banks, I guarantee you that there's going to be a major gun battle because they are extremely well armed. Conversely, I would say if you tried to attack the Fruit of the Loom underwear manufacturing facility, you probably wouldn't encounter any guns. Very unlikely. So you have to look at how you are going to likely respond to and mitigate the attack. Not only as it is happening, but even afterward as well. Because, I mean, what you do afterward can also have a direct impact on the amount of losses that you experience. So the ability to handle the attack, security's ability to handle the attack. You also have to look at the consequence analysis. What are the consequences of this attack happening? What are the consequences of this attack happening successfully? And what are the consequences of us being able to repel this attack? I mean, if you think about it, if you're the Federal Reserve and somebody comes in and tries to rob it and a gun battle ensues, then there's some things that could happen. You could have your own security personnel injured or killed. You could have your attackers injured or killed. And you could also have members of the general public injured or killed, which all of those things set you up for a certain amount of liability. And it's a matter of kind of weighing the consequences of my actions versus the consequences of allowing the attack to go on and then just suffering the loss. Because are the consequences for us for trying to repel or mitigate the attack going to be worse than if we just kind of took the hit and and went on about our business? So consequence analysis, you have to look at the consequences both of the attack itself as well as your response to said attack. And you also have to look at that in terms of the amount and type of losses that you would be experiencing. And finally, in regard to scenario-based vulnerability assessment, you need to assign a vulnerability rating. Whenever you are assessing your vulnerabilities, especially if you have multiple ones, you need to prioritize them. You need to give it a rating, and the ones that has the highest rating would be the one that you need to secure first, because those are the ones that you would experience the greatest losses, and also probably the ones that are the most likely to be attacked as well. So assign a vulnerability rating to that. Vulnerability assessment steps. Here's kind of the process that you go through. Number one, you have to identify assets in need of protection. That was in Chapter 2. We already talked about identifying the assets. Number two, review historical data. That may be what we talked about in Chapter 4, as far as looking at previous crime losses, as well as maybe even previous losses not related to crime. That'd be going back to Chapter 1 with the what cannot be measured, cannot be managed. What other losses have we experienced that are not directly related to crime? Maybe there was accident, maybe there was natural disaster, or whatever. Once you've identified the assets and reviewed your historical data, then you need to prepare a security survey. And a security survey is simply just you being able to go around through your facility and assess how secure it is. And it's really kind of a self-check tool, because nobody's probably going to be going behind you and seeing if you were right or if you're wrong, but it's more one of those things to refresh in your own mind. What are we doing to protect this asset or that asset or all assets, and is it being successful? And then if you start applying some of those scenarios to it, are we still going to be successful based upon a scenario? A particular specific event happening as an attack to one specific particular asset. So you need to prepare a security survey, and then you need to actually go do the survey. Run through the survey with your facility to see where you stand. Identify the existing security measures and their effectiveness. That's what you do as part of that of actually doing the survey. And then you need to assign a rating to each asset. And that rating will help you kind of focus on what the more important assets are. It's easy if you have a lot of assets. It's easy to get lost in saying, oh, these are the really small things. These are the ones that we can do something today, and this will be protected today, and we don't have to worry about. You know what? The really small assets are also probably the least likely to be attacked. So those are the ones that you can, I don't want to say drag your feet on, but you can put them down on the lower on the list, because you need to focus on those ones that attack is likely, and if attack occurs, big losses happen. So whatever will cost the facility or the company or the entity the most money and the most amount of losses and is the least likely to happen needs to be high on the list with a higher rating. And then finally, prepare a report with recommendations for additional security measures or changes to existing programs or policies. After you've done the vulnerability assessment, you should see more gaps or weaknesses that you need to address. And you may have to do a vulnerability assessment multiple times, even on the same asset, until you have got to the point where we don't see anything else we can do right now to further secure this particular asset. We think this asset is secure. Honestly, guys, if you think about this from a Homeland Security perspective, the Secret Service goes through this with the President. With anybody the Secret Service provides security for, they go through a vulnerability assessment. No matter where they're going or what they're doing. Let's say the President is coming to Huntsville, Alabama. There's going to be an advanced team that comes to Huntsville, and they're going to be going through steps just like these. They have identified the asset that needs protected already. Maybe they go back and say, has the President ever visited Huntsville before? If so, were there any threats? Were any threats carried out? They do a security survey of wherever the president's going to be to see what things need to be done in order to prevent or mitigate any particular losses. They will identify the security measures and effectiveness. They will assign a rating as to what are the likelihood of threats. And then they're going to prepare a report, and probably the president gets that report so he can see whether or not they really want to go to that location. And if so, here's what you need to be prepared for. And I think if you look at it in those terms, you can definitely see how we go about doing a vulnerability assessment. In your textbook, on page starting on page 100, there's about 7-8 pages there that talks about what should be included in the report. And just to kind of hit the high points on it, I want to make sure you go to your textbook and you read the specifics as to what's included in the report, but I'm going to give you some in general terms what needs to be included. First, you need a table of contents. It's just like you were writing a very short book that has specific things in each chapter, even almost like a textbook, if you will. So you need a table of contents. Then you need what's called an executive summary. And what an executive summary is basically just a summary. So if you were to give this to the president of the company, he can read that executive summary and he knows, here's what's in this report. And he may not look at any of the rest of it. He may say, okay, I've got a report on security. When I need to look at that, I've got it. And I know that I have that report and it's in here. So it just summarizes everything that you are specifically mentioning throughout the rest of the report. The next section is a background. And that basically helps you with those historical events. Why are we focusing on this asset? What have been the previous attacks or threats to this asset? And that's why we're looking at it again, because we have deemed it to be possibly vulnerable. Then you do an assessment overview. And that basically is that providing that security survey, conducting that security survey to see what the current threats or risk of loss is, how vulnerable that asset is to attack. And then you have a set of conclusions, and that's also used to summarize the vulnerabilities and provide the reader with vulnerability ratings. That's where you put that prioritized list in your report is in the conclusion. And then after the conclusion, you have a set of recommendations. And that's the suggested changes to your policy, your procedures, to the structure, whatever you deem necessary in order to prevent an attack or to mitigate losses from an attack if it is carried out. So, and then the last part will be any appendices. Any tables, documents, anything else that helps you to get to that point of drawing those conclusions and making those suggested changes would need to be included in the appendices section, which is the last section of the report. And finally, if you look on page 106 and 107, there's an outline for that report, and it's, if you look at it from an outline perspective, it is pretty thorough. There's a lot of information that would go in a vulnerability assessment report. I mean, if you think about it, this is important stuff for this particular company or facility that you're securing. I guarantee you, if you looked at a security assessment report for some large military base like Redstone Arsenal, think about how many different products and services and assets are on Redstone. There's so many various and sundry things and ways it could be attacked. That security report would be, lots and lots and lots of pages. Security report for the Fruit of the Loom underwear manufacturing facility might be 4 or 5 pages total. For Redstone, might be 300 pages. Seriously. It just depends on how many assets, how critical they are, and what are the likely threats to them, and what have you done to minimize or mitigate that threat. All right, guys. That is Chapter 5 in a nutshell. Hopefully it helps you understand that a little bit more. If you need help, make sure you reach out to me. You can send me messages through Course Messages or through my regular email, or you can give me a call in my office. This is week 5. Just remember, here in about 3 weeks, you're going to have your midterm exam. So you need to be preparing for that. And also at this time, you need to be thinking about the particular topic that you're going to write your paper on for this course. And remember that the topic of the paper is up to you, but you're going to have to weave something into it about ethical concerns and security. Now, I don't want general papers on security ethics. I want you to take some aspect of security risk management, and then as part of fully discussing it, make sure there's an ethical component. All right, guys, have a good week, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.